From time to time on Life Talks, we like to bring in one of our church family members to introduce him not only to our congregation, but to our audience. And today is one of those days. I have with me in our studio Danny McGovern, who many people refer to as Coach Danny McGovern. And he has quite the resume. He's the founder of Yes I Can Basketball, but his background, first of all, he's a Hawaiian boy, so that makes him interesting from the very beginning. But he was Texas High School Coach of the Year, where he had a 62-4 record at Nixon High School. That's mighty impressive. They take their sports very seriously in Texas. Then he was Coach of the Year at Barton County Junior College, and he led his 1989 team to a number one national ranking. He won a record-setting 28 consecutive games that year. He had 8 consecutive 20-plus wins in Barton there, and was eventually named to the Hall of Fame there at Barton Community College, and was also the Coach of the Year. Over 300 wins as a college coach. But more than all of that, in his prowess in basketball and raising up young leaders, he's a mentor. He's a man who takes his faith and uses it to impact those that come into his path, which is one of the big themes of Life Fellowship, as we want to be a blessing to others, and that begins with prayer and continues to the point where hopefully they have a relationship with Christ. Danny, thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm happy to be here and honored to be here, Dan.
Well, Danny, I've known you from afar for years. But the more I get to know you, the more I'm fascinated with your story. First of all, how did you get into coaching? Where did that start?
I think it started from an absence in my family. My father he mirrored Fred McMurray from My Three Sons. Yes.
All of a sudden, we just got old to a lot of people.
Well, we established that a long time ago.
Yes, that's
you
true.
And me.
That's true.
But my father mirrored Fred McMurray. Golly gee, boys, put on your seersucker suits and let's get to church. Jump in the station wagon. We'll go bowling after church and stop at Dairy Queen, and Mama's going to have dinner on the table. And he was the most wonderful man. Couldn't ask for a more perfect home. And then he served 2 tours flying in Vietnam. And he came back a man that none of us recognized. Yeah. And I know you and Ben did a podcast on demons. I'm certainly not an expert on that, but I'm convinced that he was affected by that, perhaps infected by demons. But it was an ugly situation. He became a man. He came back full of rage and anger and resentment, and we shared the same roof, but he was gone. He was totally absent. So I had a void in my life. And you're asking, well, how did you get into coaching? I feel that it was ignited by the men that invested in me, my coaches. So I got involved in 2 things that I think really helped me in my life: a youth church and sports. And through sports, I was involved in something called FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes. But Dan, I had some men that just really spent a lot of time investing their energy and enthusiasm and encouraging me. And at some point I said, I want to live my life like them. I want to have a life where I can live out loud and with purpose. So I think that's what motivated me.
Danny, I know that, many coaches enter their profession with, I want trophies. I want to be Coach of the Year. You accomplished that, but you've accomplished so much more because, just as we've conversed, you've made a difference in young men's lives, and you approach it with a faith foundation. With your work through FCA, through your own walk with Christ. So what is it about coaching and being a person committed to Christ that gives you this platform, and how can you best use it to help these young men?
I think the key word, Dan, would be influence, which I think somehow influenza is the origin of that. Am I right or wrong?
I don't know, but it would make a good etymological study.
I think it is. I think the influenza, where something spreads, is how that the word influence came about. And so I wanted to be a man that had that type of positive influence on a lot of young men that needed that. And oftentimes, and I love this expression, preach the gospel at all times.
Mm-hmm.
And if necessary, use words.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that really had it resonated with me, where if somebody sees me living my life in a certain way of character, that's going to get their attention.
Mm-hmm.
But if they see joy and happiness coming from me, that's going to get their attention even more.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to be a man that took a stand with certain things. And sometimes in athletics, there are some ramifications if you do that, particularly in a public institution.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I had no shyness about taking my team to church,
Mm-hmm.
Holding Bible study on campus,
Mm-hmm.
and so I was pretty bold in that regard.
Yeah. So, because I used to be a high school principal, I worked in academic settings all my life. So I know, and people, this is a fun fact. Danny McGovern knows where I grew up because we had a very nationally known, at least at one time, junior college basketball program in Moberly, Missouri. Back when I was growing up, at that time they had won more national championships. They went in the 60s, but they had won quite a few. Cotton Fitzsimmons was their coach, who eventually went on to coach in the NBA. But junior college players, now they call it community college, but junior college players often were guys that got passed over by Division I schools, or maybe they had academic struggles, or maybe they had home problems. They didn't get to fill out the scholarship forms. They didn't get noticed because they were at the wrong school or whatever. You flourished there. Yesterday we were talking, and I talked about the verse, and if some have compassion, making a difference. How is it that you were able to make a difference in these young men's lives?
And if I may add on that, Dan, the junior college programs, particularly back then, if you had been ticketed to sign at a Kansas, a Kentucky, or an Indiana, or UCLA, or wherever, but your grades were poor, then you had to go to junior college or sit out a year and not be on scholarship. Well, very few boys want to do that. So Moberly and those types of programs where I coach were loaded with high major talented players that oftentimes came from very, very poor backgrounds.
Yeah. And then after their 2 years, hopefully their goal was to be able to, to redshirt or whatever, get on a 4-year team,
transfer and make their way that way.
Yeah.
So I was very aware of the kind of young men that I had in my possession. They needed discipline. They needed somebody that can give them guidance and encouragement and love. Mm-hmm. And I shared with you a story yesterday to illustrate this. A young man that I brought in from Detroit, really rough home life, and so I was having breakfast with him at 4:00 in the morning in Hutchinson, Kansas, with 2 feet of snow outside, and I looked at him. I said, "You got to start talking to me." And I said, "Tell me something that you don't think I know about you." So he looked up at me. He said, "I hate white people." Mm. I said, "Well, Jackie, I got good news. There's some white guys I don't like too. So we'll be just fine." Well, he had such a bad home life that he couldn't go home for Christmas. He couldn't go home for summer. It was horrible. So he's basically homeless. He lived on the street. So I brought him into our home, lived with my family during those times. And he's 53 years old now. Mm-hmm. And we've continued to stay in touch his whole life. That young man buried his face in my chest so many times and sobbed and cried, angry with life. His son stood up as I inducted him in the Hall of Fame this past weekend. And the son turned to his father and he said, in the most eloquent way, "Dad, I love you and I'm so proud of you." And we talked about absent fathers. That young man, who's now 53 years old, literally moved to this small town in Kansas just to be there and support his son. He's not a helicopter dad. Mm-hmm. He's not hovering over him. Mm-hmm. But when his son when his head hits the pillow at nighttime, he knows his dad loves him and he's there. Mm-hmm. So that's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, yeah. You've been involved with Fellowship of Christian Athletes for a while. And there's kind of an impression that the secular world is so divided from the spiritual world that there's not opportunities to be able to live out your faith. But you've never let that stop you. I mean, you've integrated your faith into what you do. You teach basketball. That's what you do. But at the same time, you model your faith. What would you say to the person that says, "Oh, well, you just can't do that in today's culture"?
Well, you can. And sometimes it has to be disguised. And then sometimes if it's not disguised, you just have to defend it or let the chips fall where they may. And let me explain what I'm talking about. For example, when I got out of coaching, I was a big follower of Zig Ziglar. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I just dated myself again, right?
Yes, but I'm a big follower too. I listen to him a lot.
And I used to always listen to his tapes and cassettes when I was traveling. And he was always very motivational. And I thought that people needed that. Mm-hmm. So I developed a youth basketball program called Yes, I Can Basketball. And it was just different. It's not recreation basketball. It's not AU. But yes, we teach the game, but we teach some other things. And every day there's a message. It's called the Yes, I Can moment. And I'll take time to plan them, produce them, record them, send them to my directors in all their different gyms. This is what we're doing this series. Here's 7 weekends. This is what the message is in week 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But somebody may come up and say, Danny, is this a faith-based program? I said, why do you ask? They said, well, it feels like it. Mm-hmm. I said, it's not, but that's pretty cool. Mm-hmm. Or somebody will come up and I'm talking about the importance of choosing your friends wisely because your friends, your companions, they're like the buttons on an elevator. They're going to take you up or they're going to take you down. Well, somebody may come up to me later and say, I know where you're getting that from. That's Proverbs. If you want to be wise, walk with wise men. Mm-hmm. But a companion of fools will be destroyed. So we can integrate principles without showing scripture. We can. I think we do that effectively. Mm-hmm.
Have you seen the proximity that comes with being a coach enable you to be able to be an influence in their lives because you kind of have access to their character, to their problems, their nature, their life, and how do you use that proximity to be an influence for character, for spiritual things, for helping them survive a difficult stage in life?
And I think one of the values of sports is that, and oftentimes it does mirror principles of Christianity. I know that Paul, for example, he had a short memory. He was a sinner. He made a lot of mistakes, but he would quickly put that behind him. And so there's a lot of principles in athletics that mirror faith. And I think that it's a perfect field for boys to be exposed to that. And then now, if you're a coach and you have enough sense to keep your ears and eyes open, then you'll have an ability to help them through those storms. Teaching them some things, for example, like this. Okay, this is not good. You got a setback. You got 2 options. You can become bitter or you can become better. And so how are we going to handle this? So it's a wonderful opportunity for somebody that has the discernment, their eyes and ears open to be able to help young men through those times.
Mm-hmm. What would you say to a guy who's, he's a decent dad. He may not be a great athlete, but he's trying to raise his son up, right? And he's using sports because it's a point of commonality to them. How would you say that a dad could journey with his son during this period effectively? Because you've seen both sides of that. You've seen guys do it right, and you've seen guys do it wrong. You've lived through it. What advice would you give to a father today?
Well, if we have any fathers listening, and their daughters or sons are in youth sports or just dipping their toes in that, Dan, I would want to remind them of an article that I read in Sports Illustrated that said 70% of youth leave sports by the time they're 12. And the biggest reason that they cite is that they dread the ride home with dad. Mm. And oftentimes fathers, it's paved with good intentions, but they're a little bit too critical. Oh, you're not doing this, and so they harp on the negative parts, particularly after an event or in the game. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes it's best just to let them have fun. And just if I was give one advice to fathers like that, just let them know, I just like watching you play, and don't be so critical, or let the coaches figure that out. But just be encouraging that way.
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing. There's so much pressure from fathers. Often, you need that Division I scholarship.
Yes.
tiny fraction of people get a Division I scholarship. And was it 0.023, I think it is, percent of people who play sports in high school end up, with an NBA or an NFL or NHL contract. I mean, you're more likely to get struck by lightning in some parts of the country, I think.
It's out of control a little bit. And we see they're popping up everywhere, training academies, and there's so much emphasis put on that. I have a friend of mine, Dan, who told me that. He said, my wife and I were doing our taxes and we added up the expenses that we spent last year on our daughter, who I think is like 16 years old, on her travel soccer team, all these tournaments in Dallas and Rhode Island, Des Moines and Flagstaff, Arizona, and all of her trainers and hotels, and came up to $35,000 during the year. I said, well, why are you doing that? He said, so she can get a scholarship, but she's not doing well because her grades aren't very good. I said, well, have you thought about getting a tutor? He said, you know how much a tutor costs? Case in point.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of sets me off on a rant from time to time. People often, because of my background in education, I've had access to this, but I get frustrated with people who lose their balance in the face of athletics, sometimes because they're trying to vicariously live through their children, sometimes because they're trying to recapture their glorious past, which our glorious past is never as glorious as we remember it to be. Those moments in high school where we thought we sunk the winning field goal, but we really, that was the other guy. But and so we focus on that outcome, but we miss the journey. We miss the character lessons. We miss teaching them balance. We miss teaching them the spiritual values. And, I posted something on one of my social media accounts this week that kind of got a lot of attention. I said, I often wish people cared as much about the character and spiritual development of their children as they did about their athletic development. But those don't have to be mutually exclusive. Because you can use athletics, you can use academics, you can use all these things to develop character and to develop spiritual growth. Not every kid belongs on the dean's list. Not every kid belongs on the starting five. But every kid belongs in a world that they understand that they're created intentionally by God for a purpose. And they can live that out and fulfill that, and they can make a difference in other people's lives. And some of the most impactful people never won a championship ring or had a trophy on their nightstand. So, and that's why I like FCA. FCA invades that territory and says, and there's more. How did you get involved in FCA? Just as a high schooler? But obviously you've continued as an adult.
I had a man come up to me at one of my games when I was a sophomore. He introduced himself to me, Major Dick Abel. Mm. He said, I'd like for you to come to a Bible study. It's called FCA. I said, what's FCA? He said, Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I said, I'll be there. But I was raised Catholic, so we didn't do a lot of Bible study, and I wasn't aware of Scripture very much as a Catholic. My vision of God when I was a Catholic is that he's shaking his fist at me, Danny, you bad boy.
I want you to feel guilty.
Exactly. I had plenty of religion, but very little relationship. I really didn't know Jesus until I went to FCA. And so that's how I got involved with it. Yeah. And I had an interesting thing happen on our national convention. Can I tell you one story?
Yeah, please do.
So I'm dating my wife. It's our first date. And she's sitting across from me. And so we've been there. And so I hold her hand and I said, let me pray for us. So we prayed. She said, at the end, I prayed for to make it very clear whether this is going to be in God's will and give us the proper signs. And so she says, well, tell me, was there a moment in your life when you accepted Christ? I said, it was. I was in Hawaii, high school sophomore, go to the mainland to go to the FCA National Conference. And I noticed when I'm looking at the itinerary, on Thursday, there's going to be a clinic taught by NBA All-Pro named Jeff Mullins. And I'm talking to my wife about this. And he's an All-Pro for Golden State. He's going to do a clinic. I'll be there. So I'm on the front row and I'm watching Jeff Mullins, and he does his clinic. He does his testimony. When it's done, he says, do any of you boys want to commit your life to Christ? And I raised my hand. I said, I do. He said, come up. He said, what's your name? I said, I'm Danny McGovern. He shakes my hand, holds my hand, leads me through a prayer. And that's how and I'm looking at my future wife. I said, why are you crying? Why are you sobbing over this story? And she said, my neighbor for the last 5 years, he and his wife, Candy, have been in my homes, and I've been in their homes, and they have held my hand. They have prayed that a Christian man would come into my life. And that man and his wife, that man is Jeff Mullins, former Golden State All-Pro, that when you were a sophomore in 1972, he led you to Christ. So FCA had a big impact on my life.
Tell me God isn't sovereign. You can't make that stuff up. I mean, that is the hand of God. Danny, I've so enjoyed this first half of our conversation, and our time has reached an end for this episode. We're going to keep you around for another episode. To all of us who are listening to this podcast, you know Ben and I, our prayer for our church, our prayer for those who are followers of Christ and listening to these podcasts, that you would ask Christ to show you someone that is close to you but far from him, upon whom you get a burden, and that you could be the person that Christ uses to draw them to him, to share with them the story of salvation, how much they're loved and all that Christ did to secure their salvation, and that you could communicate that to them and share with them the hope that only can be found in Christ. And, for those of us who do it professionally and vocationally, it's wonderful. For those like Danny who take their opportunity, their platform and turn it into that, it's wonderful. Every one of us has a platform on which we can proclaim the majesty of Christ and the wonder of his salvation. So I hope that you'll be praying that prayer as well, that you might be the voice of truth in someone else's life. As always, we thank you so much for listening to us here at Life Talks. We'll catch you next time.